the first general to get the maneuver center as a whole. I mean, to deal with it and put together. How has that gone?
Well, I really was quite fortunate to inherit the tremendous work from those who've gone before me. So my predecessors here at the Maneuver Center had brought together infantry and armor. And at first, there were some skeptics about it. Some people thought, the world might end when that happened, on both sides. But what happened is the leaders who went before me built a tremendous team here, a team that built trust between each other, and then saw the possibilities of infantry and armor working together in a sustained manner, and to develop this combined arms perspective. In the U.S. Army, we don't want a fair fight. And the way you make sure it's not a fair fight is you combine capabilities, infantry with armor or mobile protected firepower, conducting effective reconnaissance operations, integrating fires and engineers and joint capabilities. It is, and we're not merging. So what are the things that
the combining,
the bringing together, right?
Okay.
Co-locating, bringing together. So what some of the concerns had been that bringing together infantry and armor would in some way jeopardize branch culture, which is important. These cultures exist for a reason within our branches, or branch competencies. But what's happened is it's actually, I think, in many ways strengthened those cultures and competencies, but then also allowed us to develop this combined arms perspective. Combined arms is basically a game of rock, paper, scissors. If you show up to combat with a rock, the enemy may have paper, but you have scissors ready to go. And you combine these capabilities in a way that allows you to seize and retain the initiative over the enemy. The enemy's reacting to you. The enemy's not thinking about what they can accomplish. They're thinking about saving themselves, because you're an effective combined arms team. It has made for a better Fort Benning. And so what we've done is we've built on the legacy of excellence that we've inherited from Fort Benning's long history. So when Fort Benning was founded, it was founded at a time when there was a lot of change. There had been a huge experience that Americans had never really anticipated in World War I. The deployment and bringing into the Army of millions of soldiers, the deploying of million soldiers to France. We're coming up on we are in the 100th year anniversary now of World War I. And then that war was horrible, right? The war was horrible because of the stalemated nature of combat on the Western Front and trench warfare. And in the period of World War I, though, tremendous innovations, technological breakthroughs happened. The airplane, the tank, and so and then soon after the war, the radio. So leaders who founded Fort Benning were grappling with all this. What does this mean? What is America's role in the world now that we've deployed and fought in a continental war on Europe? What are the implications for our Army of these new technologies? So these officers and non-commissioned officers established, really, I think, Fort Benning as the heart of our Army, because it's here where they thought about future war, learned the lessons from the previous war and applied them to the future, and they built the next American Army under a period of tremendous constraints, obviously, during the Depression. But you had officers like George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, all who came here to really develop combined arms capabilities. So a lot of people saw infantry and armor coming together here as a big change, but of course it wasn't unprecedented for Fort Benning to be a center of that kind of intellectual activity and building combined arms capabilities. Our soldiers and families are citizens of the Chattahoochee River Valley. We're completely integrated into the economy, into communities, really all across the area. And I think that the people here in Columbus understand the importance of our Army to their security and the security of our nation. And one of the things that we have really benefited tremendously from is the outpouring of support for our soldiers who have now been at war for 13 years. And what I think is really important for our Army today, probably now more than ever, when less than 0.5% of Americans serve, it's important for us to stay connected with the people in whose name we fight. We can't become separated from our society in a democracy. The support of local communities are important to any Army post, and it's so darn good here. I think that Fort Benning, no matter whatever the size of the Army is, Fort Benning will continue to play a central role really within our Army, and because of the activities that are here that are really essential to our Army at whatever size. And those activities are in 4 key areas. Leader development and education. We train all of our maneuver leaders here, from corporal to captain, and of course that's our most important activity, because soldiers will follow a good leader anywhere under any conditions of battle. We training here each year. We train about 90,000 soldiers here a year, and we're training here in ways that are very innovative and critical to our Army's current and future capabilities. We've adapted to the demands of 13 years of war. The way that we even just train basic rifle marksmanship now, with the now advanced rifle marksmanship, and the way we immerse soldiers in very complex environments where they're fighting enemies that are intermingled with civilian populations. The combined arms training we can do now. I mean, it's really been sort of a revolution in how we train. Our third key activity here is doctrine, describing how we're going to fight in the future. As you alluded to, we have to adapt. We have to make sure we're ready for the next conflict. And then combat developments. It's here where our combat development teams are the guys who make sure that we don't have a fair fight in the future. If we show up somewhere with U.S. Army on our chest in large numbers, it's not going to be a fair fight. We had 9 tanks and 12 Bradley fighting vehicles and two mortar carriers.
And what did the
and 136 great cavalry troopers.
And what did the enemy have?
The enemy was a brigade-size enemy in a defensive position. So.
What did you learn from that part of your military experience?
Well, I learned a lot from it. It really confirmed a lot of what we had thought about the essential elements of combat readiness, being ready for a fight. And so we had been given this gift. We had been given this gift from a generation of officers who led, through the 1950s into the 1960s, through the Vietnam War, really the destructive effect that the Vietnam War had on the Army, transitioned our Army into a volunteer force, and then affected a renaissance in our Army. As we went to combat in 1991, we went to combat with the best peacetime Army, I think, in the history of the world, probably. And it was because of a very sound doctrine. We understood how we were going to fight. We had very strong training. We trained really under tough, realistic conditions that replicated combat very closely. I mean, the National Training Center, when you went there, or the Troy Raiders Training Center, I mean, it was hard, and so we had the result of that training and the result of leader development and education meant that we were at such a high level of readiness, and that readiness built in us confidence. So we were so confident in our individual abilities, as leaders and soldiers, but we were confident in our weapon systems. We had great equipment, our Abrams tanks and our Bradley fighting vehicles. But then we really were confident in our ability to fight together as a team, and we were a very cohesive, confident team. And so, Stonewall Jackson, since I'm here in Georgia, I should quote Jackson, I think. Jackson said, "In war, there is a power greater than mere numbers." And we were so powerful as a cavalry troop, as a cavalry squadron, a regiment, as an army, because of that confidence that we had, and how we had developed the cohesive, well-trained team. Well, what it did is, I think it helped me understand some of those essential elements of combat readiness. But when you're thinking about war and combat, the first thing you need is a big dose of humility. I think one of the reasons why we had this lopsided outcome in the Battle of 7-3 Easting and Desert Storm had a lot to do with our competence, but it also had a lot to do with the enemy. There are 2 ways to fight the U.S. Army: asymmetrically, which means you try to avoid our strengths, or stupid. And the Iraqis in 1991, they chose stupid. I mean, they tried to meet us on our own terms, and so we could bring to bear all of our tremendous advantages. Now, what we have seen in the very difficult fights and long fights in Afghanistan and Iraq is that we are continuously interacting with an adaptive, determined, and in these cases, brutal enemy, right, who's going to try to do everything they can to evade our strengths and attack what they perceive as our weaknesses. So that means we have to adapt faster. We have to innovate faster. We have to we really understand these complex situations and understand how we operate to get to that sustainable outcome consistent with our interests and consistent with the risks our soldiers take, you know, and worthy of the sacrifices that our soldiers make. And so in many ways, in the Gulf War was certainly easy compared to what we've encountered in Iraq and Afghanistan for a number of reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, the enemy, you know, met us on our own terms, but also we had a very narrow, circumscribed political objective. Give Kuwait back to the Kuwaitis, right? And then we went into a long period of containment of Saddam. Obviously, the demands of the situations both in Afghanistan and Iraq were much different and much more difficult, and we had to face an enemy that adapted to us over time. Multiple enemies, actually. One of the key things is, you know, we don't talk about our enemies enough, you know, and I would just ask the question, how many Americans could name the 3 main Taliban groups who were fighting in Afghanistan? Now these people, they're the enemy of all civilized people. I mean, if you look at really what the Pakistanis are encountering in North Waziristan, where these brutal, murderous criminals have had control since about 2004, they're finding people who have been just brutalized, repressed, abused in the worst ways you can imagine. And this is their vision. I mean, this is their vision that people who have a similar ideology are trying to impose in Iraq now. So I think it's important for Americans to pay attention to who is the Quetta-Shor Taliban, who is the Haqqani network, you know, who is Hezbi Islamic Gulbuddin, what are their ties to Al-Qaeda, and what do they stand for? Because if you listen to them, just as if we were to listen to the Nazi Party in Germany in the late 1930s, they tell us what they're going to do if they're able to gain power, and they show it to us through their brutality. So I think talking more about the enemy and what is at stake would help Americans understand better why we need our soldiers engaged in these conflicts to protect really our own vital interests and really the interests of all civilized people. Well, I've always been drawn to the study of history, and I think for military professionals it's really important to understand the past, because there are a lot of things more that change, you know, new technologies, different types of combat and operations, as we're seeing now, you know, a dramatic difference obviously between the Gulf War and these protracted counterinsurgency and security campaigns that we're conducting in Afghanistan and Iraq. But I think it's important in particular to understand your most recent experiences as an Army, because a lot of times people say, you know, oh, gosh, you know, the military, they're always ready to fight the last war, but actually the opposite is the case. The problems you have in the next war are oftentimes because you studied your last war only superficially. You didn't study it enough really to learn the lessons. And remember, after Vietnam, oh, we're just not going to do counterinsurgency anymore. We're not going to deal with these complex environments in which we're contending with enemies that operate on multiple battlegrounds: a physical battleground, a battleground of political subversion, a battleground of perception, a battleground of really criminality and transnational organized crime. I mean, but heck, we did. I mean, we did have to fight wars that posed those problem sets. So I wanted to learn from the Vietnam conflict. I had a great deal of respect for Vietnam veterans, especially after the Gulf War. So in the Gulf War, we had a very short war, a war in which we were able to defeat the enemy and eject, you know, the enemy out of Kuwait and deliver a significant blow. Achieve the objective, and then go home in a relatively short period of time. But not all wars are like that, you know. And in Vietnam, where you had a protracted conflict during which it was very difficult for leaders to explain to their soldiers how the risks they were taking and sacrifices they were making were contributing, again, to that outcome, that accomplishment of the mission that's worthy of those risks and sacrifices. So I wondered, why was there so much ambiguity in terms of how what we're doing militarily was connected to the overall war aim? And so I went into the research asking that question, and then it really became an effort to understand how and why Vietnam became an American war, and how and why decisions were made that led to that kind of ambiguity. I never felt anything like that. I didn't think that the book or the research in any way was going to jeopardize my career. You know, some people have a misunderstanding about the Army. Some people think that, hey, you're in the military and everything is super hierarchical, and you're in an environment that is intolerant of criticism, and people don't want frank assessments. I think the opposite is the case. In the Army, because the stakes are so high, right? I mean, you can't just be a yes man and say, you know, great idea, boss, if you don't believe it, right? Because lives are at stake. And the commanders that I've worked for, they want frank assessments. They want criticism and feedback. So if you offer it in a way that's grounded in good analysis, and it's respectful, and if you're giving recommendations that are clearly aimed at advancing your mission, I think the Army and the military broadly is very tolerant, even more tolerant than maybe other organizations. So I didn't encounter any of that. I think there are a couple of reasons, though, that helped. One is the time, right? It was 30 years later. And so, I mean the wounds, the emotional wounds weren't as open, you know, and had begun to heal. And the other reason is that time allowed a lot of evidence to come to light. So before, when you would write about Vietnam, you would have to fill in the gaps with, you know, some opinion and conjecture. What had happened is what was available to me were a broad range of documents that were not available previously. Documents from the most private meetings of the president and his advisors. Whereas before, only the more public meetings, you know, the big National Security Council meetings were available.
So you got the behind the scenes
right,
stuff.
Tapes of telephone conversations and so forth. So that really allowed me to ground the analysis in the book into evidence. And then still, there were a lot of leaders who I could talk to. So that being able to combine the documentary evidence with oral histories and interviews was a tremendous opportunity.
You recently were named to the Time magazine list of the 100 most influential people in the world. I mean, that, on the face of that, I mean, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, I think it may represent a misunderstanding of where influence comes from in the Army. Because in the Army, influence doesn't come from any individual. You know, influence comes from teams, right? And you work on everything as a team. So, you know, it's obviously it's an honor to be, selected on a list like that. But also, I think, as you know from how eclectic that kind of list is, you know, I don't really personally put any credence, you know, in my selection. I think I would hope that the selection is more along the lines of selecting a soldier to represent the Army as a team.
What's your reaction to what General Barno said that you are a rare breed in this Army?
Well, I'll tell you, when I look at the talent of the officers that are and the non-commissioned officers we have in our Army, I'm humbled by it, you know. So, for example, the officer who's about to replace me here, I would gladly serve as his deputy anywhere, anytime. General Scott Miller is going to be just great for Fort Benning and great for the community here. So I think if you think about influence, right, what you basically can do to influence your organization is to give people the freedom to take initiative, because they will always exceed your expectations. The strength of our Army is, one of the key strengths of our Army is what we call the philosophy of mission command, which is basically decentralized operations based on mission orders, which means, hey, I'm going to ask you to accomplish a mission, but I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You can figure it out. That's the strength of the American Army, you know, is that kind of initiative and ability to apply your imagination to problems. And what I've found here at Fort Benning and across my career is, if you give people the freedom to take initiative and help give them the resources they need to accomplish the mission, they're going to always exceed your expectations.
What do you see as the future of the United States Army?
Well, I think the future of the United States Army is to be able to fight, win, and accomplish the mission as part of joint teams, which means along with our Air Force and Navy and Marine Corps, but also interdepartmental teams. We're going to be working, again and multinational teams. The problems we're facing today, security problems, are problems that involve multiple nations, and really the enemies we're seeing in the greater Middle East and Afghanistan. They are the enemies of all civilized people. So, how do we work together as part of a broader team to defeat our enemies and accomplish the mission and get to those kind of sustainable outcomes that protect our security and our vital interests? And so, you know, the key thing for us to consider, I think, as we think about the future, is first of all to work collaboratively. You know, we've got to work across the whole Army, right? Because the future course of the Army is what 51% or more of the Army believes it is every day. You know, so you can't work in a vacuum. You got to work with everybody, you know, on it. But the key things we have to consider, I think, are 4 key areas. The first is missions. What missions are we going to be conducting in the future? And of course, we have a say in that, but our enemies, you know, have a say in that. So you have
when
to
you say
consider
missions, you mean where we fight?
It's where we fight, but it's also the types of missions we're going to conduct. So I think you can determine your missions through the Defense Planning Guidance, which said, hey, what our forces have to be able to do is you have to prevent conflict, because we know in the Army and in the military, better than anybody, what the costs are of war, you know, the human costs of war. And so we want to prevent conflict by being ready. You know, George Washington said, you know, the best way you can make sure you have peace is to prepare for war. You know, and he was right. So we have to make sure we're prepared for war, so that people know that if you pose a threat to the United States, it's not going to be your interest, because you're going to be defeated. So preventing war, shaping security environments, work with our partners across the regions. That's the second one. Yes, and then to win, to be prepared to win. You know, when our security is threatened. I think we see a period of increased threats to our nation. What we have I think seen now is how easily technology can be transferred, you know, to not just to other nations, but also to these transnational terrorist organizations who have access to more and more destructive weapons. You can see a threat from long-range ballistic missiles, you know, that can be hidden and fired against us. So what this means is, for us, is that we have to have land forces prepared as part of joint teams to deploy quickly, to transition into offensive operations, to defeat enemies, and then to establish security conditions so we can accomplish the mission overall. And then we have to also be able to do that, as you know, in context of fighting with other nations' forces with us, and then to be able to you know, to fight enemies that are intermingled with civilian populations in increasing urban areas. So we have really, as we think about the problem of future war, the key thing is to define really what are the missions we're going to have to conduct, what are the threats that we're going to have to deal with, the enemies, the adversaries in that environment, and to understand technology, how technology is changing for us and for the enemy, but then also to think hard about what have we learned, what are the historical insights and lessons. Well, I think cyber terrorism, espionage, you know, is as we're learning, is a significant threat. In fact, this is the cyber domain, you know, is a contested space every day already. And so the key question is, how does this fit into the overall problem set in future war? And the key thing, I think the key thing for us is really going to be to how we develop systems that are resilient, right? That are able to allow us to operate, communicate freely during operations, and then also we have to learn how we disrupt enemy capabilities to affect us. So I think we have some really great people working on this right now, but of course this is a relatively new area, you know, that we have to cope with. Here at the Maneuver Center, we have stressed the importance of developing systems that are resilient, that you know that can operate degraded, because we have to recognize that we have to be able to absorb attacks of many kinds, cyber, physical attacks, and then come back with a pretty strong counterpunch, right? So we want to make sure that our systems aren't fragile, and that we can operate degraded if necessary. What you see a lot of times in our, you know, as you look at military service, is you see the challenges and the costs associated with it, right? And those are obvious ones, right? I mean, there's nothing tougher than seeing fellow soldiers killed in action or severely wounded. But you know, there's also other challenges associated with long times away from home, you know, and deployment to, you know, to tough environments. But the rewards of service they're less tangible. They're harder to see, you know, and that is being part of an important mission and being part of a cohesive team that's bound together by trust respect, and it becomes like a family. I mean, an Army unit becomes like a family, and it's, I don't think that's replicated, you know, in any other profession.
You can see the horizon of your career from where you are, I would imagine. What does a post-Army career for you look like?
Well, I'll tell you, as of right now, I can't imagine doing anything else for what I'm doing, you know, and I am kind of in the bonus round now in the Army, you know. I mean, I have had the privilege of serving for 30 years, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to continue serving in the next position. I'm sad to leave Fort Benning, though, you know, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue serving. So